In the last nugget, we talked about distance vector and link state routing protocols in broad brushstrokes. So now we want to talk about a specific distance vector routing protocol, EIGRP. This is Cisco's baby. They created it. So let's look at the terms, the metric, and the benefits of using EIGRP. So what's up with EIGRP? Well, as I mentioned just a second ago, it's Cisco's baby. They designed it because they looked at all the routing protocols out there and said, we can do better. And the way they did it was primarily by combining the best of distance vector and link state together. Now, in the last nugget, I mentioned that the link state build the entire topology database. So the larger and larger your topology gets, the bigger and bigger the database is. So router 1 knows not just about its primary path, but let's get that WAN link plugged in. Not only its primary path, but knows its backup paths, knows its neighbor's backup paths, knows their neighbor's backup paths, which makes it very efficient. Should something go down, it's like, man, I've got the whole roadmap at my disposal to find backups. But also, the bigger and bigger your network gets as you keep adding routers to this group, the more inefficient it gets because that database starts to grow out of control. And so you have to start splitting into multiple databases. That gets into multiple OSPF areas and things like that. So Cisco looked at that and said, well, let's do this. Let's set it up to where we can have the routers. Let's say this is just router 0 over here. Router 0 will learn just what its neighbors tell it because that's really all you care about. I mean, does router 0 really care if that WAN link goes down? Not really. I mean, essentially, the neighbor of their neighbor might care, and that neighbor might affect this. But router 0 just cares what best path its neighbor is using. So it's like, well, let's do that. Let's start there. And so it learns the best paths of its neighbors, but let's allow it to keep some backups. You see, with just about every routing protocol, it only generates a routing table. Right? And the routing table is the best of the best paths that is chosen. When you do a show IP route, you are not seeing all the paths the router knows about. You're just seeing the best paths. And the router immediately forgets about everything else. Now, I know you might say, well, doesn't it have the database if it's a link state? Well, yes, it does, but it's not, I mean, the database is not quickly, like millisecond level accessible. It has to run calculations on that database to find a new best path. So Cisco said, well, let's not worry about a database. Let's generate the routing table with the EIGRP with the best of the best, but let's do this. Router 0 is hearing what its neighbors are telling it. I don't know why I drew that as a WAN link. It's not. So let's put the second best and the third best and whatever alternate paths it learns from its neighbors into something called the topology table. And that topology table will be able to move routes into the routing table with no measurable delay. Like it's so fast you can't even blink your eyes. Blink, blink, blink. It's so fast it's there. You don't drop a ping. So the topology table is kind of like a halfway middle ground between, like, for instance, a true distance vector routing protocol who says, well, I can't even say true. Let's just compare against RIP, who generates the routing table and then forgets all the others. So when its primary goes down, it has to scramble and rediscover what other paths might exist. And then, like I said, it's a hybrid between that and then link state database where it generates the whole database and eats up a bunch of resources. Cisco says, well, let's just generate this topology table. It's a good middle ground, which is great. It's a good setup. So some of these other ones, so you've got backup routes. This kind of combines with those backup paths. It has fast convergence through the mechanism called dual. Dual is just the... when you create something cool, you name it. Like if I were to build a video game, I would call it like Ethereal Mind or something, whatever. It would be, I'd come up with some cool name that I'd be like, I patent that, I name that. Well, that's what Cisco did. They came up with an engine that runs EIGRP. It's just essentially the algorithm of it. And they called it Dual, the Diffused Update Algorithm. Just like OSPF, I don't know if you knew this, OSPF, its algorithm is actually SPF. Shortest path first, which was, some people call it the Dijkstra's algorithm. How do you spell it? It's like Dijkstra. Is that it? Dijkstra is the guy who created that link state algorithm. Is famous. You can Google him, and he looks like he looks like one of those guys that can like melt you with a mind. College professor. So he called it SPF. Well, Cisco calls their duals. So that's where that comes in. Simple configuration. When you see it, you'll love it. It's easy. Flexibility and summarization. So with link state protocols, you can't summarize. You can't. And summarization, again, means let's say you've got a router with a whole bunch of networks, let's say 192.168.1.2.3.4.5.6, all these different networks, and I say, well, you know what, let's just say I've got 192.168.0.0/16. I've got all the 192.168 networks to my neighbors, so they don't have to have all these routes in their routing table. I can summarize it by just saying one. It helps you be very efficient. Well, you can't do that with link state databases because everybody's got the same database. You can't like hide pieces of the databases if everybody has the same. The only way that you can summarize is by breaking into a new database. And that's why in OSPF, you can only summarize on what's called area border routers. Routers that divide up OSPF areas or databases from each other. And so it's painful. But with EIGRP, you can summarize wherever you want. If I want to pick a WAN link and say, well, I think the most efficient thing is right there, I don't have to think about areas or databases. Oh, man, that's going to mess up my design. I mean, nothing like that. You're just like, well, I just go under the interface config mode, and that's where I do it. Unequal cost load balancing. Only protocol that does this. OSPF, let's say you've got 2 T1 lines. It can load balance. It can send one packet here, one packet here, one packet here, back and forth, back and forth. But what if you mix a T1 line and a DSL connection? Maybe the DSL has, I don't know, 5 megabits per second. And you're like, wow, that's great, but it's not super reliable. But I'd love to be able to loop together my DSL and T1. OSPF, game over. You can't do it. EIGRP, you can say, oh, well, this is 5 megs and this is about 1.5 meg. So why don't you figure that out? And EIGRP will. It'll be like, okay, well, it's not going to be perfect, but it'll say, well, let me send like 3 packets on the DSL for every one that I send on the T1 line. It kind of generates that algorithm. So very cool feature. So let's get into the mechanics of EIGRP. When you bring up an EIGRP router and configure it, it automatically builds 3 different tables. First, a neighbor table. It actually builds them in this order. It finds out who's my neighbors, who are some compatible routers that are also running EIGRP in my system, aka autonomous system, that I can exchange route with. So it forms those neighbors and says, okay, great. Now let's exchange routes so we can all build our topology table. The topology table is everything the router knows about. Now, it's not a link state database. So for example, let's say router 4 actually had WAN links down here to router 5 and 6, and they had some connections over here to network 1. Well, router 4 is going to pick the best of the best. It's going to say, well, I like router 6 as my primary route. The second one is going to go in my topology table. Like this is my primary, this is my backup route. Or we'll get in the terms in a second. It's going to be called a successor and a feasible successor, but forget that for now. So router 4 is going to have that in its topology table, but it's only going to advertise the best one to router 1. So router 1, at least for network 1 down here, is going to say, okay, well, I only have one route in my topology table and one route in my routing table because I only have one path to that network, and that's going to be through router 4. So all the routes build a topology table, and let me give one more example. Router 1, for example, would say, okay, I have 2 routes in my topology table to 10.1.2.0, and that would be router 3 and router 4. Then it will generate the best. So it builds its routing table. That's third. It says, okay, and of those 2, router 3 is the best, and that goes in my routing table. Or maybe it says router 3 and router 4 are the best, and those will go in my routing table. Now, what do you think it's doing if it does that? Load balancing. Okay, now the most difficult part of EIGRP, which really isn't too difficult at all. It's the terms. If there's one, EIGRP is designed to be simple, but if there's one thing that'll catch you, it's just the term because they're kind of funky. So what we've got is some terms that we need to know, and then I'll throw out one important rule for you. EIGRP calculates routes based on the feasible distance and advertised distance. Feasible distance is how far it is from you if you are a router. So for instance, router 1 will have a feasible distance to network 10.1.2.0. And that means that is how much it costs, bandwidth and delay, and you'll see some of the metrics in a moment, for him to reach router 4 and then for router 4 to get there. That cumulative cost is called the feasible distance, how far it is from me. Advertised distance is how far it is from your neighbor. So router 1 says, okay, well, feasible distance, maybe it cost me 100 to get to this network. But from router 4 told me it only costs him 10 because it costs him, maybe 10 metric units, which we'll talk about in a second, to get out this interface to that network. So it costs him 10. So this, just looking at this topology, that means this must be 90 because my feasible distance is 100. Advertised distance is how far it is from my neighbor. Then you might say, well, okay, Got it. But why do I care? Well, trust me, there will be a rule where you'll care. So let's now look at this term: successor and feasible successor. Successor is the primary route that made its way to the routing table. So both of these are in the topology table, right? That it maintains. So it's in the topology table. Successor is the primary one that made it to the routing table. The feasible successor is the backup route. And there will be one or two, or it could be multiple feasible successors. Essentially, those are the ones that are just sitting there in the topology table waiting to be called into the routing table, but they're not being used right now. Okay, so think of successors like he's the king. Feasible successor is the how about I use something I understand? United States. This is the president, and this is the vice president. So if the successor dies, the feasible successor takes over. Who takes over if the king dies? I don't know enough about kingship. The vice king. Active route, passive route. Active route and passive route. Initially looking at that, you're like, okay, so this is the one being used and this is not being used. Exactly the opposite. Right? So when you're looking at the topology table, you'll actually see a report of which routes are active and which ones are passive. We want to see passive, 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 passive. We want to see passive everywhere. Because passive means they're not, EIGRP is not having to take action on them. Like, they're just good routes. Pat them on the head. Like, for instance, I have 4 children. I love it when my children are passive. I'm like, good job, children. A very good job sitting there, being quiet. Now, my son, actually sons, plural, have gone into active mode, which is where I have to get them under control. Active means the route is down, and EIGRP is actively trying to find a backup, right? So whenever you see active, both with children or with routes, it's a bad thing. So that, I mean, again, you see how all these terms work. Okay, now here's the rule. You ready for this? I'm going to read it. It's not going to make sense, and then I'll break it down, and it will. Here's the rule. To be considered a feasible successor, the advertised distance must be less than the feasible distance of the successor. See, I told you. Doesn't make sense when you first read it. So what do you mean, Jermaine? What I'm saying is not every route is good enough to be considered a backup. Just because a router has 2 paths to a given network does not necessarily mean that the second one is always going to be a feasible successor. It's not always going to be considered a backup. It has a specific rule, and it says to be a feasible successor, the advertised distance, and this is why these terms now are important, the advertised distance of, let's say this is the primary, right? So that's the primary. It says the advertised distance of this route must be less than the feasible distance of this route. Okay, now go back to what these are. So essentially, my router says, okay, it cost me 100 to get to this network, and that became my primary route. Let's say this WAN link, maybe its cost was I don't know, 50, and this well, actually, let's say 500, and this one was a cost of 10, right? So the total cost for this was 510. Lower costs are better, lower metrics are better. So it says, okay, well, I've got one route that's 100 and one route that's 510. So does that mean it can be a feasible successor? Well, again, that's the wrong answer. Or wrong question to ask. It's that what we have to ask is say, does this advertised distance, is that advertised distance less than, so is 10 less than the feasible distance of the successor? Yes? Yes? Good. Then this will be a feasible successor. Oh, wait a sec. Did I say feasible? Let me read it again. To be a feasible successor, the advertised distance, so that distance, it's the same thing. I think I just said the wrong word. Must be less than, not less than or equal to, less than the feasible distance of the successor. And in this case, it's true. So this, if this were the diagram, would become the feasible successor. It would become a backup route in there. Okay. Poof. Our heads explode, right? Questions. Well, okay. What do you mean, Jeremy? So are you saying, what if this was a cost of 100? Let's say this is 10 meg Ethernet, and this is gigabit Ethernet, or 100 meg Ethernet, or whatever. So this is a cost of 100. Let's play that scenario. Okay, this is a cost of 100. Is his advertised distance, which is now 100, less than the feasible distance of the successor? And the answer is no, it's not. It's equal to. And that does not mean this rule is valid. So this one does not become the feasible successor. Okay, so question number 2, does that mean if the primary one goes down, tornado takes that guy down, does that mean the second one won't be used as a backup and now we have a network down situation? No, it does not. All it means is this guy, instead of having the instantaneous, like, whatcha, there's my backup, and nobody even noticed that the primary one was down, it has to send query messages out and say, hello, anybody out there? And by the way, that is when the route is in an active state, is when it's sending out queries. It's like, hello, hey, I lost my network, 10.1.2, it's gone, man. It was there, and it's gone. Anybody have a backup? This guy's like, nope, I don't have one. This guy's like, oh yeah, I have one. Its advertised distance is 100, and router 1's going to be like, that's good enough for me. It's all mine. Let's take it. So it will become a backup. This path will be used. See, I have to scribble heavy when my screen is full of scribble. It will be used. It will just take longer than if it were a feasible successor. Okay, so answered a couple questions. Now let me ask the question that I probably would have asked when I first saw this. What on earth is this rule even there for? This just seems like a complexity rule for no good reason. Like, okay, why? Okay, what this is Cisco's loop prevention mechanism. Let me clear this off, right? So the way, without getting into the details, because it can just melt your mind. The way it works is, since EIGRP is a distance vector routing protocol, it only knows what its neighbors tell it. So there's a chance, for instance, let's say over here we've got, I'll just call it the one network. Maybe it's 10.1.2 or something, right? So we've got the one network. The one network is advertised here to this router. He advertises it down here to this router. So he's got the one network. He advertises over here, one. And then this guy ends up becoming a neighbor. He'll advertise the one network back, right? Well, with this rule in place, this one network, essentially it's impossible for this one network to ever enter into this guy's topology table. See, because Cisco designed EIGRP to be so fast that, for instance, as soon as this network went down, let's say this guy's like network down, if this were in its if he was accepting that advertisement from this, we'll say router 5 down here, if he was accepting that, it moves so fast when it realizes the network is down that it might switch over and point to start using that guy before it has a chance to realize that that guy really was looping back around to get to him in the first place. And he would cause a temporary routing loop while all the routers figured it out. So Cisco said, okay, let's put this rule in place so that when this guy advertises to this guy, and this guy to this guy, this guy to this guy, and this guy back to this guy, it is impossible for this guy's advertised distance to be less than the feasible distance of that guy. So, you can do it. You can put some metrics up there and actually figure it out and be like, oh, he's telling the truth. But I would just say, sure, go for it. If you really want to prove it to yourself, it works. But I would just say, believe me, that's why this is there. It's a loop prevention mechanism. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. A beautiful day in the neighborhood. Won't you be mine? Wait, that's not how it goes. I can't believe I've just forgotten this song to Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day and I have told Mr. Rogers, I have failed you. Nonetheless, let's get back to EIGRP. There's something inside of me that wants to go on YouTube and find Mr. Rogers' theme, but I'll do that later. EIGRP neighborhood is, how do these neighbor relationships form? So first off, if you're coming out of OSPF is so picky. It's like you got to have the same area, the same subnet mask. You have the same hello timer, right? Same dead timer. Like they have all these requirements for OSPF routers to be a neighbor. Whereas EIGRP is like, man, you're just running EIGRP, and if you're in the same system as me, like you're in the same universe, aka autonomous system, we can be neighbors. Let's do this thing. So this is the EIGRP neighborhood and how these guys speak together. Again, simplicity was Cisco's goal. So first off, hello packet forms neighbor relationships. They say hello. They both realize they're running EIGRP. By the way, this is the multicast frequency, or radio station I always call it, that they're tuned into, 224.0010. So they're both talking. They realize they're in the same autonomous system. They're like, hey, let's be a neighbor. They then send updates to each other. And the updates is essentially their routing table. They're like, man, here is the best of the best routes that I know about. And once they exchange that, that's it. They just say hello, hi, hello, hi, hello, hi. Back and forth on whatever hello timer interval that you've set. They will keep saying hello to make sure that the other one is online. Now, if something bad happens, we'll see a query message. A query is always sent if a route is lost. So for example, and it doesn't even matter, if this guy loses his own LAN interface, he doesn't know. He's going to send out a query message saying, hey, does anyone have a backup to this route? Chances are good that, if that environment, this guy would come back and be like, no, I don't. So the route, by the way, changes to active when it does that, and then finally gets removed from the topology table once it receives all the queries back that there is no backup route. So a reply is a response to a query, right? It's easy, right? So I lose a route, I send a query, it's like, no, I don't have a backup route. So that's the reply. And then finally, we've got an acknowledgement, which acknowledges the update, query, and reply messages. It does not acknowledge a hello message. It'd be like, hello, oh, got it, hi. Hello, oh, got it, hi. That'd be a waste of bandwidth. But every other packet is acknowledged to make sure that it got to the other side. Oh, I knew I didn't want to do it. I've spent the last 15 minutes now looking at Mr. Rogers. They even have a Mr. Rogers remix, which is pretty good. But here it is. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Mr. Rogers, you will be missed, my friend. Let's talk about EIGRP metric calculations as Jeremy slips into insanity. So the metric of EIGRP is complex. There are multiple values known as K values. So when you hear people talk about EIGRP's metric, people will say, well, it's the bandwidth. And others will say, no, it's the delay. No, it's the bandwidth and delay. No, it's the K. I mean, it truly is a hybrid metric that could be variable. So first off, let's talk about the defaults of EIGRP. By default, EIGRP use the bandwidth and the delay as the metric, also known as the K1 and K3 values. However, you can also loop in reliability and load into the metric calculation. So let's just talk about what these are. Bandwidth is obviously how much bandwidth is available on the link. Delay is supposed to be how long it takes a packet to get from one side to the other. Reliability is how often that link goes up and goes down, as in, how reliable is that? Is it a link that fails often, or is it a link that's fairly stable? And then finally, the load. The load is how much bandwidth, or I shouldn't say bandwidth, how much traffic is currently crossing that link at any one time. Now, there's a very, very specific reason Cisco decided to only put these two into the calculation out of the box and allow you to add the other two in. These two are static values, meaning you manually type those in under the interface. Now, the bandwidth, that initially makes sense. It's like, okay, so I pay for a 256K circuit, so I type in bandwidth, under the interface, I type in bandwidth 256, and I statically configure that. But most people don't know that you also statically configure the delay in the same way. I go under the interface and type in delay and statically say how long it takes the packet to go on that link. And now delay could mean different things to different people. It could be like a serialization delay, how long it takes it to put from the router onto the physical wire. It could be a delay of how long it takes to get to the other end. But either way, it's pretty much a guess for the most part. I guess you could say serialization delay could be figured out statically, but you just type in a number. We'll say 2000, and there's a default number in there. Those values never change from there on out. These values, however, are dynamic. And because of that, even though Cisco's like in their marketing material, they're like, oh yeah, we're better than anybody else because we can also support the reliability and load. Don't ever use it. Please don't. Just keep it in the marketing brochure. That's what Cisco's saying, because if you use these values, then every single time they change, and they will, especially the load, as soon as somebody opens a web page, the load of your serial link goes up by 1. And the router's like, oh, load is up by 1. Recalculate the EIGRP routing table. Oh, it's the same. Oh, it went down by 1. Oh, recalculate the routing table. Oh, it's the same. This just causes dual, remember that algorithm, dual, to keep running again and again and again and again anytime one of those dynamic values change. Now, you'll also hear that the MTU is included in the metric. It's not. It's actually transmitted as one of the criteria that, so it says, okay, the maximum transmission unit, that's how big of a packet can be sent on that link. It's transmitted as one of the values, but it's not actually part of the formula that EIGRP uses. Now, that's why this guy's here. What's up with that formula, right? OSPF, if you remember, pretty much took 100 divided by bandwidth in megabits per second, and that was OSPF's cost formula. That's how it figures it. So it's like, good grief, what's up with that? Well, Cisco had to make this crazy complex because they had to have the potential to add in all these values and have them influence the metric. Now, if I boil it down, let me just say, here is the real default metric. Now, you won't have to memorize that. There won't be, well, okay, whatever. It could happen, right? It could be on the certification exam, but I've never, that would just be, like, why would you do that? Why? I would not be able to quote that K value off the top of my head, ever. And if they put it on the exam, I'd refuse to learn it just because I'd realize how pointless it is. But it's not. So just boiling it down to a simple example, really, if you keep everything the default, which Cisco suggests, you can take 256 times the slowest bandwidth in kilobits per second. By the way, bandwidth is not, they don't just say, well, let's throw the bandwidth. It's actually 10 to the 7th divided by bandwidth in kilobits per second, and that would be what's filled in here. And then you add in all link delays. Now, the unique thing about EIGRP is it's the slowest link bandwidth. Okay, so for instance, if let's just say this guy in the middle is 64 kilobits per second. And you're trying to reach this network over here, 10.1.1.0. When it comes to router 1, when it's trying to figure out how much it costs to get to that network, as opposed to maybe going this alternate route, what he's going to do is say, okay, we got 256, 64, 250. He's going to be like, okay, that's it, because these guys no longer matter. It doesn't matter. These could be, OC 192 insane speed connections. But we don't care because we have to go through that slow link in the middle anyway. So EIGRP forgets about all these. It's like, whatever, I'm running my calculation on that. So it's going to do 256, and you could, put it in the equation, 256 times, and then we'd have 10 to the 7th, 10 caret 7, divided by, that'd be 64K, plus, well, I guess we'd do a little double parenthesis action here, plus all the link delays. So 2,000 plus 2,000 plus 2,000, all the link delays that we have to go through. And that will actually equals this boy's brain, your metric, if you were to figure that out. Now, Cisco realizes that you don't have a calculator on the exam. So you're not going to see crazy complex questions like this. However, I have been asked what would the metric be, at least now keep in mind it's been a while. Cisco has revised the CCNA, and they continue to move more CCNP material onto the CCNA exam. So I was asked in the CCNP certification environment moons ago. I really don't think Cisco would ask you this. However, so when you do a show IP route, and you're going to see some really funky numbers for the metric next to your routes, this is how the router is calculating them. I throw that formula up there just to show you there is a formula. And you can change the K values. As a matter of fact, by default, if we could go back to that, there we go. All of these K values, K4, K5, K2, they are all set to 0. Which is why they're not included in the calculation. So that's why I can boil this formula down to this, is because really, K3 K5, K4, if they zero out, it pretty much crosses that whole piece of the equation out. If K2 is 0, it crosses that piece of the equation out. So it really makes the formula simple. K1 and K3 are just set to 1 by default, and you can change that, but I wouldn't, and Cisco says, why we'll give you the flexibility to do this, but why on earth would you do that? So whenever you hear what is the EIGRP's metric, just think, okay, it's the K value formula, or really, it's just the bandwidth and delay that is factored together. So now we have seen, why would we choose EIGRP? Well, again, it's very simple to set up. It does its thing. It's got very simple boundaries, like you can summarize at any point. But its Achilles heel is that it's Cisco proprietary. So you have to have Cisco routers everywhere to run them and have an organization comfortable with running proprietary protocols. Second thing, we looked at EIGRP's terms and metric to where we saw, for instance, feasible distance, advertised distance, successor, feasible successor, all those terms. Those, I would say, are probably the most tricky part of EIGRP because you have to try and remember them. And then we saw the overly complex EIGRP metric calculation formula. Again, primarily there as an FYI. That's what's behind the curtain. But normally, and I have, let me just say this, I've never been in an organization that has decided to adjust their K values in any way, even to include the factors like reliability and load into the calculation. It's just not something that you do. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.